Cereal Box presents Remade, Season 2, Episode 5, Man's Best Friend. Written by Amy Rose Capetta. Narrated by Greg Tremblay. Don't you want to know why you're here? Jingwei asked. Why we're all here? The rest of the teens looked at one another, nervous or doubtful, but Hiram kept his eyes on Jingwei. She'd been back for a while now, but Hiram couldn't stop staring, even though he knew it wasn't polite, even though she had caught him at least twice. He'd believed for so long that this was the afterlife, although each death shook that belief a tiny bit, like an earthquake that didn't really do much but rattle a few books off a shelf. And then Jingwei showed up without memories of any of them, and with a metallic companion. And Hiram's world had started shaking. Hard. It hadn't stopped since. You're telling us that caretaker knows why we've been remade? May asked. May was good at being practical, even when Hiram was swirling into a panic. Hiram made a mental note to thank her later. Jingwei patted the caretaker on the head. Well, I'm pretty sure that's what Sparky said. It can be hard to tell sometimes. The caretaker swung its large red eye from person to person. Hiram found himself straining forward, breaking the line of the small group as he took a baby step in the direction of the caretaker. He didn't trust that thing. But if it had a reason for all of this, shouldn't they at least hear it? All right, Sparky, spit it out. Jingwei crossed her arms, then her eyes went fuzzy and far away, like she was looking somewhere on the horizon. But the way she'd described it, she was actually looking at pictures in her own head. Hiram felt something deeper than a shiver, a sliver of discomfort that went all the way down to his soul. Sparky's showing me something. I still don't like the idea that it can drop thoughts into her head, Inez muttered. Am I really the only one who has a problem with that? Please raise your hand if you have a problem with that. The hands of pretty much everyone in the little group, May, Gabe, Sebastian, Amelia, Alex, and Inez herself shot up. Saya shrugged. I don't think you'd like it any more if the caretaker was talking to us with an actual voice. Good point, Inez said, shuddering. Hiram hadn't put his hand up, but that had nothing to do with liking the notion of caretaker telepathy. He was just so confused, disoriented. He had no idea which way was up or down, where he was, who he was. If he'd really died and been brought back to life, was he still Hiram? Did he still have the same opinions that Hiram would? Would the Hiram he remembered being want to know what this caretaker had to say? Okay, I see a handprint, Jingwei said, and then a picture of a worm, and then a big pit, and that's definitely a picture of Earth, and then a bunch of people, like an enormous crowd of them, and then Earth again. That's the all-important message? May asked. Doesn't really make sense, Saya added, like she was sorry for stating the obvious, but the obvious was important. Look, Jingwei said, sitting down unceremoniously on the nearest rock. She was clearly at the end of her patience. I'm doing my best with what I have, and what I have is a keeper. They weren't made to interface with humans, so they do the best they can. Sorry if we're not throwing that thing a parade, Inez said, shifting her weight. Her ankle was still a mess, and she'd half-hopped all the way here, ignoring Hiram's and Gabe's attempts at help. Hiram felt bad for Jingwei, too. She had no idea what their group had gone through. If she'd been there when Teddy had died, would it be so easy for her to lean against one of the caretaker's legs? Its bright eye flared at her touch. That would have looked cute if Hiram weren't afraid it was waiting for the right moment to dismember him. Jingwei might not have been afraid to rest against the caretaker, but she did look exhausted. She put a hand to her forehead and rubbed it furiously, as if Sparky's message was still repeating in there. Remembering a trick to get rid of headaches that he'd learned from his mom, Hiram stepped toward her to volunteer the information. Here, at least, he could be helpful. But when he stepped toward the remade girl, Sparky rushed between them, two pincer legs up as if it would attack. Saya grabbed Hiram's arm and dragged him back, and the caretaker retrained its red eye on her instead. Saya's breath stopped hard. She held herself perfectly still. Hiram looked around. Inez was glaring at everyone, including Hiram and Saya, and Sparky. "Nobody move!" Gabe, Amelia, and Sebastian all leaned forward, ready to rush at Sparky if it came down to a fight. Hiram should have been scared in that moment, but he wasn't. Or at least not as scared as he knew he should be. And that, in itself, was scary. Did it only take a few minutes of seeing a human with a caretaker to make him want to trust it? After a moment, the standoff went stale. Hiram decided it was safe to take a step backward, and then Sparky scuttled to Jingwei. "You can keep your purpose," Inez said. "I have one that I came up with myself. No caretaker help needed." Hiram knew what she was talking about. Inez had made it her purpose in life to keep the rest of them safe, and so far she'd actually managed it. Hiram owed her his life, they all did. Inez marched off into the woods, not heading toward camp, just in case the caretaker was keeping track. They had made a plan to leave Jingwei's camp in a different direction each time they visited. "Go ahead," Jingwei said to the rest of the teens. "Keep playing Follow the Leader. You're really good at it." "At least the one leading us around is human," Amelia muttered. Everyone tramped after Inez, Hiram giving Jingwei and Sparky one last look over his shoulder. Both the girl and the caretaker seemed to be watching them intently. When they were officially out of sight and probably hearing distance of Jingwei and the caretaker, they caught up to Inez, who had stopped to swear at her ankle, profusely, in at least 2 languages. Gabe offered his arm in a gentlemanly way that May rolled her eyes at and Hiram envied. "Stop trying to carry me around like a—" More swearing. "Princess," Inez said. In an attempt to make up for scaring Inez back at Jingwei's camp, Hiram grabbed a decent-sized branch from the ground and stripped off its leaves. It wasn't a species that he recognized, but it was sturdy and yet lightweight, a perfect walking stick. He held it out to Inez. Her frown collapsed, but it was quickly replaced with a fresh one. "We need to smoke out Jingwei." "What does that mean?" Sebastian asked. "We don't share supplies. We stop visiting. Either she's with the caretaker or she's with us. She can't play it both ways and keep putting us in danger. At some point, that thing is going to follow us back to camp, or she's going to, and then tell her precious death machine exactly where to find us. Can you imagine Holden and Loki and everybody coming back to a caretaker? We said we'd find a safe place to rendezvous. This is like leading them into an ambush." "You can't just decide," May started. "This isn't a dictatorship," Inez assured her. "You saw what happened when Holden made decisions for everyone and didn't check in first. Not pretty. So we'll vote. All in favor of cutting off the caretaker?" Inez stuck her own hand in the air. Sebastian and Amelia raised theirs quickly, and Gabe followed close behind. May added hers with a roll of the eyes that made it pretty clear she still didn't like the way things were being run. They didn't need Hiram's hand to go up to have the majority, but he raised it anyway. Inez caught Hiram's gaze and nodded slightly. Only Saya's and Alex's hands stayed down. "Don't you want to hear what it has to say?" Saya asked. Inez didn't scoff, not at Saya. She seemed to think it over first. Then she looked right at Saya and said, "It already had a chance to tell us what it wants, and it went after you instead." Hiram thought about the caretaker in the clearing. It hadn't really gone after Saya, or even Hiram. It had only moved to protect Jingwei. He didn't think he'd have much luck convincing Inez, though. "Maybe the caretakers brought us back for a reason, but it's a caretaker reason. These are our lives now. They don't get to take you away from me." Those last words came out fast, and they changed Saya's whole expression. She had been ready to argue, but now all she could do was look at Inez like she'd written her a love poem. Her eyes went wide, and she even sighed a little bit. Hiram knew Inez liked girls, everyone knew that. Did Saya feel that way too? The whole thing made Hiram's brain tilt slightly, as if the contents were sliding and settling in new places. "All right," Inez said, shifting on her feet. Someone needs to go back to Jingwei's camp and tell her that she has to make a choice. She can have until the end of the week. I think May should go, Gabe said. She's good at this sort of thing. All in favor? Everyone's hands went up this time. And if she doesn't choose by then? May asked. We'll have to assume she picked the caretaker, Inez said. Hiram watched May disappear in the direction they'd just come from. Gabe and Saya immediately began talking about the bizarre message the caretaker had brought them and what it could possibly mean, and whether or not Jingwei was really a robot spy. Hiram hung back, waiting until their voices were overtaken by the sounds of the leaves and a dry, raspy cry that must have been some new kind of bird. Hiram had memorized every species in the North American Field Guide, and he didn't recognize it. He waited until the rest of the group had turned into tiny dots of color in the distance, and then he ducked into the woods, alone. Hiram stood at the base of the trail. He wasn't supposed to hike alone, nobody was, but he'd left his aunt and uncle's house with Basco on his long lead, and his feet had taken all the right twists and turns to end up here. His aunt had shown him the trail on a map the previous day and said it was an easy summit hike, a tourist hike, really. Hiram was used to much longer and trickier ones when he went with scouts or with his dad. Where his family lived in Utah, the world was a web of hiking trails tangled over the mountains. Hiram told himself that he wouldn't be gone long. The rest of his family had taken a little trip into Asheville to do vacation things, but he'd woken up late, and his mom had let him take a rare sleep-in morning. He looked down the path where it shaded into gloom. Even though the day was bright with nearly impossible beauty, it was the kind of day that made him feel like the sun and the wind and the clouds were keeping him company. Besides, Hiram had Basco. The dog was already snuffling around in the underbrush, the sound of his nose against the leaves making Hiram laugh. He was the most excitable dog Hiram's family had ever owned. Hiram had convinced his parents to let him volunteer at a dog rescue, even though they worried he would come home with a different dog every week. He managed a whole year before he saw this pointy-eared, skinny-legged puppy, and there was no leaving without him. His parents had wanted to board him during their trip, but Hiram had done everything short of begging to get him to come along. Now Basco tugged and tugged and tugged at the lead. All right, boy, Hiram said. I'm with you. He followed down the trail, or rather, up. As soon as his steps settled into a rhythm, his mind released from its nervous, locked-up mode and started to travel the complicated paths of Hiram's thoughts and feelings instead. School was fine. At least the school parts of school were fine. He was getting straight A's, except for a lone B in chemistry, which was okay because he'd stretched himself to take the AP class early. He knew his parents were proud of him and that his little sisters and brother looked up to him. His older sisters still treated him like the cute baby brother they'd put in their doll clothes. And then there was seminary in the mornings and Boy Scouts and band. He belonged to all of those groups. At least, he showed up to all of those groups. But lately he was starting to feel a little bit off to the side. No matter how hard he tried to speak up in Scouts or say 2 words to Sarah in chemistry class that weren't about acids and bases. None of his friends seemed to have this problem. But then none of his friends seemed to be his friends anymore. They weren't mean to him or intentional in leaving him out of their plans to go to $2 movies or coffee shops on the weekend. They didn't push him off to the side. It was just where he ended up, naturally. And the thing that helped most was to take a walk by himself, identifying every plant species as he went, even though it made Basco dance with impatience. He was already half a mile into the hike when he remembered that he should have left a note for his parents. He pulled out his cell phone to send a text, but no service showed up. He thought about turning back, but Basco barked, a hard, dry bark, and pulled him forward. He never could resist Basco. As Hiram gathered firewood and chased down edible plants, he kept telling himself that he wasn't really breaking the rules Inez had come up with, the rules he'd just agreed to. He wouldn't share the supplies from their camp, but Jingwei had to be hungry, and what if she didn't know what was safe to eat and what would result in a quick, painful death? Could she hunt? Hiram didn't remember. He knew that she was a fantastic builder and would have no problem whipping up a camp out of whatever was nearby. They really could use her help. He'd found non-poisonous mushrooms and gathered an armload of firewood when he heard the sound again. The one that he'd thought was a bird. It was more like a bark than birdsong, actually. Dry, raspy. It was also, from what Hiram could tell, a little ways off. He was already deeper than he'd meant to go, and he didn't want to lose the path back to camp. And if there really was a wild animal out there, he shouldn't look for it alone. He moved toward it anyway, feeling a magnetized pull. For one wild flash of a second, he didn't care if something ate him. He'd die and go to the afterlife, which is where he thought he'd been this whole time. But Hiram really didn't want to die. Again. So why was he running, sweating inside his windbreaker? He heard the sound twice more before he could identify the reason he was moving toward it, the comfort and familiarity that came with it. The sound reminded him of a dog. Hiram remembered hearing that dogs had lost their survival skills. Their footsteps didn't leave neat tracks like wild animals anymore, and most were terrible hunters. They'd grown sloppy and comfortable from depending on humans. But that was their survival skill, and it had worked really well, at least while there were still humans around. Hiram couldn't remember seeing a single dog since he'd been— His mind jolted hard over the word remade. He came to a clearing where the trees were mostly downed, probably by a storm, judging from the way their long, skinny bodies had fallen. They were young trees. Hiram didn't know why that bothered him, but it did. In the fall of trees, caught in a snare of branches, was a cumberbatch. Hiram went into nature mode, noticing several things at once. It wasn't nearly as large as the ones they'd seen circling Arcadia. One of its wings was pinned, leaving the other one free to thrash. That free wing looked powerful, possibly dangerous. It had a leathery sheen to it, marbled with veins. The cumberbatch pointed its face to the sky. Hiram was strangely reminded of the iron his mother had used to make the creases in his pants. The cumberbatch's face was shaped like that iron, and it had a dulled shine, though it was more bronze than silver. It puffed in breath and let out the sound that had drawn Hiram across the woods. The raspy sound it had been making wasn't like Basco's bark, telling him to hurry up, asking for attention or food. It was a cry. The cumberbatch needed help. Hiram looked around, as if someone else might be coming, but he and the cumberbatch were alone in the clearing. If the creature had a pack— Did dragons travel in packs? It was gone. Hiram approached carefully, one soft step at a time, until he was crouched down in front of the branches. He met the glossy, dark eyes of the cumberbatch. It was the size of a large cat or a small dog, and Hiram could tell it was a baby. He didn't quite know how. Maybe because of its size, although it could just have been a smaller version. But there was something in its eyes, the blinking, needful way it looked at Hiram. "Hey there," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "Don't worry." Hiram cleared away the farthest of the branches to make sure the wild creature didn't startle. It just kept making that sound, but this time it made the sound in Hiram's direction. "I hear you," he said. The cumberbatch quieted down. Did it understand him? It was definitely staring at him, its little iron-shaped head cocked. There were some tricky branches stuck on the wing itself. Hiram knew that they would scrape against the wing's leather. He just didn't know how much it would hurt. Was the membrane like skin, easy to irritate? Was it like actual leather, supple and hard to breach? Or was it something completely different? Something Hiram couldn't imagine. He needed to keep the cumberbatch distracted while he went about the delicate work of picking away each pointed stick. Before he could figure it out, the cumberbatch broke free with a fierce cry. Hiram expected it to fly off at once, but it didn't. It stared him down, crying and crying and crying. This wasn't the help cry. He had enough little siblings to know the difference. This was the "you're not doing something I want you to do" cry. "Sorry," Hiram said, drooping a little. "I don't know what you want." It was one thing to have a hard time with other humans. It was another to find out that even baby dragons thought you were a disappointment. The afternoon light was deep gold, and Hiram's heart picked up speed. He knew how quickly the woods can turn from lovely to menacing. All it took was darkness pouring in. "I have important things to do," Hiram said, thinking of Jing Wei and how much she probably needed the dinner he had gathered. He turned, walked a few steps, and with a heart-numbing whoosh he found that the baby Cumberbatch had perched on his shoulder. It had flown there in one clean sweep. Its wings ruffled his hair, its talons were definitely going to leave a hole in his windbreaker. He knelt carefully to collect the firewood, his heart racing. There was a small, but unmistakable dragon on his shoulder. "If you're going to stay up there, you should at least know my name. It's Hiram. And since I can't ask yours, I'll just call you—" The Cumberbatch's feet dug into his shoulder, and Hiram gave it a wry half-smile. "All right, Talon it is." The Cumberbatch squawked, and despite the discomfort of the little creature's grip, Hiram felt much better than he had a few minutes earlier, when all he could do was worry about Jing Wei and Sparky and being remade. "Come on, Talon," Hiram said. "We have a delivery to make." Almost to the summit, Hiram was feeling great about his hike. Basco had been in a good mood too, but then he usually was. Life seemed simpler for dogs. Their struggles were mostly about kibble and treats and getting as much of them as possible. Maybe finding an exciting bush to sniff. Right now, though, Basco was a little subdued, his nose angled toward the path, his ears lacking their usual spring. Hiram stopped and gave him a few sips from his water bottle, the one important hiking staple he had managed to bring. Basco obediently smacked and slurped, but it didn't seem to liven him up. "What's wrong?" Hiram asked, clinching Basco in a furry hug. Basco shook off whatever was bothering him, and they fell into step, taking the rest of the trail side by side instead of the usual way, with Basco tugging Hiram along at top speed. Soon a wooden platform at the top of the trail was in sight. Hiram stopped to catch his breath, stretched his calves, took a quick sip of water from the bottle that had been full when they started, and was now down to quarter level. The day was hotter than he'd expected, with a slight pressure bearing down as they walked. But now that they were at the top, the air felt clean and thin and charged with incredible energy. Hiram wanted to capture it and take it back down the mountain with him. He wanted to keep this feeling as he looked out over the dark blue mountains and the dark green woods, the light blue page of sky and the clouds scrawled across it like some ancient language. He wished Dad were here to see this. He had taught Hiram to appreciate a good view. They'd been drifting apart recently, but this was one thing they still shared. How did it happen, Hiram wondered, that he always seemed to make the wrong decision lately, at least according to his dad? He didn't know what to say, what to do. Hiram turned in a slow circle and it settled him into place. Each new slice of sky brought him a different shade of the same feeling. The world was enormous and beautiful, and Hiram was small. A good kind of small. He fit into something bigger. That was what he'd gone on a hike for. It was like praying. It was asking a question and waiting to feel the answer. Hiram kept turning, breathing in little bits of the beauty. The light blue sky turned darker and harder, and 3/4 of the way around, Hiram's mind stumbled across the truth of the sky. A storm was moving in. Clouds poured like smoke over the hills, dark as doubts that couldn't be held down. They were pressing toward him. Fast. Hiram shouldn't have believed he could read the weather here as well as he could at home. It was a different place with different rules. He should have paid attention when Basco was trying to tell him something earlier. Dogs always knew. Hiram told himself that he was just going to leave the food and firewood at the far edge of Jingwei's camp, toss a stick in her direction to let her know she should check the perimeter, and run. It was probably a good thing for him that Inez was still getting better, otherwise she most likely would have rushed back and found him by now. Hiram immediately felt guilty for his relief. How could he be happy that Inez was hurt? Did that make him a terrible person? What about the way he hadn't kept his word? What would the rest of the group do if they caught him? May should have been done giving Jingwei the group's ultimatum, but what if she was still walking back to camp and saw Hiram going in the opposite direction? He hadn't really thought through this rule-breaking. He had simply thought of Jingwei and known that he couldn't let her go hungry. Hiram walked slowly, looking for signs of May, but he didn't hear or see anyone else in the woods. It was blue dark by the time Hiram settled the mushrooms and edible grasses into a pile. Jingwei looked busy working on her new shelter made from downed trees. Sparky scuttled over the top of it to work on one of the seams. They were building it together. They were also arguing. "I don't get it," Jingwei said to Sparky. "Those pictures you showed me don't make any sense." Hiram thought through the images again. A handprint, a worm, a pit, the earth, a crowd of people, earth again. Sparky scuttled around, frantic. "Yeah, showing me again doesn't help at all," Jingwei said. Sparky stretched out its long legs, locking them in stubbornness. The caretaker and Jingwei had reached a stalemate. Hiram really did want to know why they'd been brought back. How could anyone not wonder about it? Their life since being remade was dangerous, bordering on impossible, and they had almost died so many times. Hiram didn't want to just run from one set of troubles to the next. If they were part of something bigger, he wanted to know. Hiram was so caught up in his thoughts that he didn't notice some of the firewood he'd gathered was slipping. It crashed into the brush. "Who's there?" Jingwei turned, her eyes two flashes in the dark. She had always seemed so confident to Hiram, but now her voice rattled with nerves. "Don't come any closer." "It's just me," Hiram said, stepping into the clearing, his hands up, the rest of the supplies in his arms tumbling to the ground. Even though his entire body had twitched with fear and surprise, Talon was still perched on his shoulder. "Oh," Jingwei said. "Are you here to tell me that I've been given another ultimatum by the group?" The way she said it, the group, sounded like something ominous or ridiculous or both. Hiram wanted to explain that the group was a good thing. They were the only reason he was alive, that they had all kept one another safe. But Hiram had never been particularly good with getting words out when he needed them most, so instead he just said, "I brought food." Jingwei's eyes went from wary to delighted in a single blink. "I thought I was going to be in protein bar purgatory for the rest of my life. What's your name again?" "Hiram." She held out her hand. "Jingwei. We met. Before." "Well, I didn't meet you," she said, pumping Hiram's hand before running past him to the food. She shoved half the mushrooms in her mouth in a single handful. Hiram stared at her chipmunk cheeks and tried, very politely, not to laugh. At least now he had an excuse to stare. Jingwei looked as real as any of the other teens. Did that mean Hiram was like her? That they all were? Was Hiram more like this new version of Jingwei than he was like his old self? What about his soul? Had it been transferred from one body to the next, or did it stay with the first Hiram? Did he have a new soul? Or none at all? His religion had answers for a lot of things, but being remade was not one of them. After a few more wolfish bites, Jingwei slowed down to savor the rest. Hiram's attention, which had been completely focused on her, was now pulled toward the caretaker in the center of the clearing, its legs splayed outward, its middle insides sparked blue and deadly. "I shouldn't be here," Hiram said, his voice thinning. "Because of Sparky?" Jingwei said. Hiram nodded. He didn't know how to explain that it wasn't just a rule. Every time he saw this caretaker, he saw every caretaker, including the ones that had tried to kill him and his friends. Jingwei must have looked at Hiram's face and seen a distraught mess because she didn't push it. Instead, she nodded at Hiram's shoulder. "Who's your friend?" "Oh," Hiram said, angling his right shoulder forward so Jingwei could have a better view of the baby Cumberbatch. "This is Talon. The caretakers told me that these guys were made as pets. Not by them, but by the humans while they were still around." "That makes sense," Hiram said. A bizarre kind of sense, but at least it grounded him in something familiar. That was why Talon had reminded him of a dog. Maybe that was even why, in his head at least, he'd started to think of Talon as a boy. He was more than a little bit like Basco. Jingwei walked over and petted the Cumberbatch's long, leathery wing. He seemed to bask in her attention. He made little gurgling noises of happiness. Then Sparky lumbered to its spider feet. Hiram stepped back and stopped breathing. "What is it doing?" "He's asking about you," Jingwei said. Before Hiram could ask her please not to tell the caretaker anything about him, she turned to Sparky and said, "His name is Hiram, and he's a sensitive soul." Jingwei cocked her head. "Now he's asking what a soul is. You want to field this one?" Hiram stumbled backward. He couldn't explain souls to a caretaker, especially not now that he wasn't sure about his own soul. Good luck," he said weakly, and ran away. In his moment of panic, he forgot to pick a new direction to confuse Jingwei and Sparky. His feet pounded a straight line toward camp, and he had to hope that he hadn't given them all away. By the time he arrived at the cave, the moon was crisp and high. Near the entrance, a fire was banked low for cooking. Inez stormed toward Hiram. "Where have you been? We thought you were dead. We sent out 3 different search parties." Hiram looked up at the Cumberbatch, who had already grown used to his perch. "I found this little guy, and what?" Gabe asked. "You caused all that trouble because you wanted to play with a baby dragon?" Hiram felt ridiculous all of a sudden. "He needed me." "That thing is not a pet," May said. "Actually, it is," Hiram said. But telling how he'd learned that would give away where he'd been, who he'd been talking to. Before anyone could follow up with questions, he added, "I mean, that's a theory I have." The baby Cumberbatch shifted on Hiram's shoulder, like he could sense that people were talking about him. Saya walked over and took a look at Talon, standing close enough to Inez that their arms were touching. Talon stretched out his wings for Saya, and she put one finger under his pointy little chin. "Maybe we could keep him." "Cumberbatches aren't dangerous," Hiram added. "I mean, they look kind of scary, but none of them have actually hurt us in any way or tried to. And besides, this is a baby. He's separated from his pack." He paused, remembering how little he actually knew about Cumberbatches, about this whole world they lived in. "Well, probably." "Vote?" Saya asked. Surprisingly, every hand went up to keep Talon with them, at least for the night. "But tell us before you run off anywhere," Inez said, a little of her fierceness returning. Hiram nodded vigorously. He needed his alone time, but he didn't actually want to scare his friends. And everything was good for a second, until Hiram remembered that he was lying. He hadn't just been out in the woods with Talon, he'd been feeding Jingwei while she talked philosophy with a caretaker. Sparky. That was probably what Hiram would have named it too. Hiram moved through the cave away from Inez and Saya and Sebastian and Amelia and Gabe and May. When had everyone coupled up? Hiram hadn't really noticed until it was practically over. He and Alex were the only ones left, and Alex barely talked to anyone. Hiram liked Alex's quiet and calm. It was one of the few constants in their new life, and it made Hiram feel like they could face anything. Right now, he was off in a corner, so deep in his black hoodie that he'd basically created a little world that nobody else was invited to. Hiram wondered if Alex felt uncomfortable with the rest of them right now. He was the only one who hadn't voted to smoke out Jingwei. Hiram worried over whether or not he'd left her enough to eat as he built a little nest of sticks and leaves for Talon next to his bedroll. Talon did a drowsy little snuggle dance as he settled in, right against Hiram's side. Strangely, Hiram found himself thinking of Jingwei leaning against Sparky. Was it easier to let a Cumberbatch into camp only because none of them had been killed by Cumberbatches? Hiram closed his eyes. He saw a caretaker, and he wanted to run. But Talon chose that exact moment to snuggle into his side, keeping him in place. Hiram took a deep, comforting breath of Cumberbatch smell, which was a little bit like old leather shoes, and Hiram's breath eased. Hiram was shaking, hard as he ran down the mountain. The rain poured in gouts. Basco was drenched, his fur turned into ragged strips running with water and drip, drip, dripping fast into the mud. Hiram ran his hands over his clammy, wet skin. It might have been a warm day when he started out, but this rain was freezing. and he was only wearing a pair of shorts, a t-shirt, sneakers. None of the light layers that he knew you were supposed to wear for hiking. No long pants, not even tall socks. He was completely unprepared. Lightning sizzled, and Hiram braced himself for the thunder, but it came faster than he thought it would, less than a second after the brightness. A tree just below the path came down with a murderous crack. Hiram didn't know if it was safer to keep moving or to stand still and let this chaos pass him by. If he kept walking, there was the chance that he would fall and hurt himself. If he stayed still, he couldn't be sure that the trees that sheltered him wouldn't be more dangerous than the rocks along the path. He decided to huddle under a tall shrub. If this was a single-cell thunderstorm, it would be over soon. He pulled Basco's long lead tight and kept him right by his side, hoping that their warmth would prove more powerful than the ruthless cold of this rain. Basco nuzzled at his legs. The comfort that usually came from hugging him was faint, but it was there. Hiram pulled his phone out, desperate for even a single bar of service, and his fingers slid over the wet case. The phone landed in a puddle, face down, with a slap, and then a hard crack as it met a rock. Hiram picked the phone up, trying to keep his hope from splintering until he saw the shattered face, trying harder to tell himself that everything would be fine as soon as the storm passed. The next day, Hiram took Talon on the morning watch with him. Away from the cave, the trees took over. They were East Coast trees, not too different from the ones Hiram had memorized out of his dad's old guidebooks: ash and beech and birch. There were also species he couldn't name, including a maple-like one with wavy leaves. Still, when he was out in nature, it was usually easy to pretend that he was back in his old life, the one without caretakers lurking in the woods, without the word remade lurking in his mind. But today it was harder to fool himself, because having Talon perched on his shoulder was a constant reminder of how much things had changed. And Alex, his watch partner, was walking nearby, much closer than he ever had before. That was different, too. Alex swung the spear he'd brought as his weapon at the ground. His steps wandered. Even after months in the wilderness, he still acted like someone who'd barely spent a minute in nature. He'd clearly never been a scout. But it was strange how little Hiram knew about him. Did anyone really know Alex? "How big will Talon get?" Alex asked. "I don't know," Hiram said. "What does he eat?" Alex asked. "Good question," Hiram said, focusing on the simple problem of feeding Talon instead of the much more complicated ones swirling all around him. "What do you eat, little guy?" Alex dug in his pocket and held out some late-season blackberries he'd scavenged. Or maybe the seasons had shifted now, and the berries were ripe longer. He offered them to Talon, who sniffed but didn't eat. The creature made a huffy sound, offended. Alex shrugged and kept walking. A few minutes later, Hiram heard something in the brush, and Talon lifted from his shoulder. He took off like a neatly released arrow, picked up a squirrel, broke its neck with a quick shake of its head, and flew back to drop it right in front of Hiram's feet. Talon squawked in triumph. A few minutes later, he had built up a nice pile of squirrels. He flew lazy circles that turned deadly the second he saw something skittering on the forest floor below. He brought the limp creature straight to Hiram with a look on his face that said, "Aren't you proud?" He remembered the skunk Basco had killed once to impress him. His parents had been mad for weeks. "Wow," Alex said, watching the heap of dead animals grow. "With Talon around, we might never have to hunt again. We've got more than enough for dinner, for a week. Too bad we're not allowed to share with Jingwei." "I brought her something to eat yesterday," Hiram said, the stored-up truth coming out in a big rush. "Yeah," Alex said with a slight smile, looking at Hiram from under dark, peaked eyebrows. "That doesn't surprise me." Hiram felt an itch at the back of his neck, as if Alex had stared right through him and seen too much. Hiram didn't want to be the only one admitting something, so he asked, "Why didn't you vote to smoke her out, even with Sparky?" Alex watched Talon circle the clearing and come back to his resting spot on Hiram's shoulder. "We've all been together for a while. Jingwei's been on her own." He slashed at the ground with his spear. I know what that's like. Hiram wanted to ask more, but he also didn't want to scare Alex immediately back into his hood. Should we take Jingwei some more food today? Alex asked. Maybe Talon and I can help. Hiram wanted to say yes, but he wasn't thinking about Jingwei anymore. All he could see in his memory was the caretaker, the way it had stared into his two eyes with its one deep red one, the way it had wanted to know about souls, about him. I think she'll be okay for a bit, Hiram said, hating himself for being such a coward. There was a rustling in the brush, bigger than the squirrel this time, and Talon took off again. But instead of diving, Talon circled once, twice, and decided not to attack whatever was in the woods. Hiram saw a blue flash. Sparky. How long had it been following? How had Hiram not noticed? Talon and Alex were too distracting. Sparky's bright eye and blue sparks emerged from the woods. The caretaker wasn't running at them. It was stalking them quietly, carefully. Alex held up his spear. If it came down to a fight, it was just two boys, one spear, and a baby dragon against all of that metal. To make things worse, Talon didn't seem interested. He circled above the clearing, carefree, looking for his next squirrel. Maybe caretakers didn't attack Cumberbatches? Or maybe Sparky really was a friend, like Jingwei said. Did Talon know the difference between caretakers that were safe to be around and the ones that would murder you? Let's go, Alex said, backing away slowly. We can't lead him back to camp, Hiram said. Inez would never forgive them, and she would probably be right. What else are we supposed to do? Let it stare us to death? Alex asked. But Sparky wasn't just staring. Sparky was acting exactly like Basco when he wanted to tell Hiram something and Hiram wasn't listening. Sparky looked at Hiram intently. He nudged forward, step by step. Hiram held his ground. He let the red eye get closer to him, even though he could see all his fears shining back at him. But Alex started to run. Alex! Hiram called. Wait! He tore after Alex, who hadn't run back toward camp. At least there was that. Sparky crashed after him, and then Hiram wasn't so sure anymore because having a caretaker hot on his heels felt exactly like it had every time before. It felt like rushing towards some unknown, impossible safety while a storm of metal closed the distance. Soon it would be on him. He gasped for breath as he ran, and then he heard a rush of steps from another direction. Sparky ran off, back toward Jingwei's camp. Alex, still running ahead of Hiram, slowed down. A spear split the air in front of Hiram's face and landed in a tree a few feet away with a solid thunk. Talon circled above, screaming. Hiram had almost forgotten him in the chaos. Inez appeared from the other direction, looking calm and ready to handle anything, another spear lofted in her hand. Hiram! Alex, shit, she said. She waved off Gabe and Amelia, who were running up behind her. Are either of you hurt? No, Hiram said, although he almost had been. But it wasn't the caretaker who had been dangerous. Not this time. It was their own fear. What are you two still doing out here? Inez asked. Your watch ended a while ago. Hiram's inability to lie turned into a sticky ball in his throat. Talon wanted to hunt. The Cumberbatch seemed to understand that the dust was settling because he returned to Hiram's shoulder and settled his prickly little feet. Inez frowned. I swore I heard... There was this huge noise in the brush, and I thought... Alex opened his mouth, and Hiram could feel what he was about to say. Something about Sparky creeping up on them, chasing them. Hiram shook his head at Alex, hoping it was a small enough motion that Inez and the others wouldn't catch it. He didn't want Jingwei to get into trouble. He didn't want them to chase off Sparky. Not yet. Not if it knew what their purpose was. It was nothing, Hiram announced stiffly. I know I heard something, Amelia said, narrowing her eyes at the two boys. Alex grabbed Hiram's hand, lacing his fingers through Hiram's, closing them together. Hard. Maybe it was just nerves, but Hiram's fingers pressed back. Yeah, Alex said. We, weren't being subtle. Sorry about that. Hiram was a terrible liar, but Alex had clearly mastered the art. He was so convincing that Hiram looked down at their joined hands and flushed with heat. Inez looked at Alex and Hiram, mostly at Hiram, with another one of those grins that started out small and smirky and then grew to epic proportions. Wow! I know I said these are our lives and we should make the most of them, but I did not see that coming. Inez squinted at Hiram. Okay, maybe I did. She clapped him on the shoulder that Talon wasn't perched on. Hiram coughed, hard. We should probably get the squirrels Talon caught, Alex said. Inez shooed the others ahead of her back toward camp. Hiram got the distinct feeling that Inez was giving him and Alex space. As soon as they'd gone back and gathered Talon's heap of death, they fell into step beside each other. The late afternoon wrapped them in a sort of quiet that should probably have been suffocating, but wasn't. If not for the dead animals stacked in his arms and the lingering worry over the secrets that were piling up, Hiram would have called it perfect. And that made his brain tilt again. Everything had been tilting lately, hard and fast until Hiram didn't know what to think, what to feel, and which feelings to trust. Sorry about before, Alex mumbled, his hood drawn all the way up. He looked at the sky, which had gone sickly gray. It would probably rain later. Hiram didn't know what to say to that. That's okay. It felt nice. It felt too nice. He didn't say anything. Why didn't you want them to know about the caretaker? Alex asked quietly. Hiram gave him a long look. Do you believe in God? Alex didn't balk at the question like Hiram worried he would. He just shrugged. Some days? Hiram couldn't imagine that, but Alex probably couldn't imagine growing up like Hiram had either. My dad liked to talk about science. He would say, God made everything, so how could he not know about atoms and black holes, and that means he even knows about being remade. Huh, Alex said. That's kind of cool. Maybe this is... Hiram fumbled to grasp the enormous idea. His way of bringing us back. And if he did that, there has to be a reason. And you think the caretaker wants to tell us? Alex said. It was more than that. I think Sparky wants me to figure out what it's saying, Hiram said with a nervous certainty. I think it picked me. If Hiram stuck to the path, he would make it down the mountain fine. But the rain blurred the ground. It was almost impossible to tell what was the path and what was just a place you could take one step and then another, and then a few more before realizing that you weren't on the path after all. The ground under him broke with rocks and rippled with roots, and all of it was shattered by the constant fall of rain. Hard, unrelenting rain that had no intention of stopping or slackening. It took Hiram too long to figure out that he wasn't on the main path anymore, but a small spur that hit a dead end at a harsh downhill. He doubled back and started to climb up again. Soon he had lost the path entirely. He trudged through mud closed in by trees. He pictured his family getting back from their trip into Asheville and realizing Hiram was missing. He didn't let himself think the word dead. Instead, he thought about his dad and how he would shake his head at Hiram's misadventure. How could he not be a little disappointed in his son, who was supposed to know better, who shouldn't have needed a walk like this in the first place? Hiram climbed harder than he'd ever climbed before, his calves so tight he felt like the muscles might snap. While he moved faster, time seemed to get stuck in place. He was living the same minute over and over again, the one where he was climbing in the cold rain, Basco a step ahead of him. The one where he felt sure he couldn't keep going for another minute, but told himself he had to. And then he had made it to the place where the trees thinned and the summit came into view. If he reached the summit again, he could find the main route and stay on it. It was like stumbling across the right turn in the path and finding a panoramic view of his hope waiting for him. As he stared up at the summit, he heard a crack so loud and so close that Basco pulled the lead out of his hand with a friction burn. Hiram should have listened. Hiram should have followed. But he was so terrified that he couldn't move. The tree moved first, crashing down, Down. Down. That night, everyone feasted on the meat Talon brought back. They even canceled patrols for a few hours so everyone could take turns cooking and eating and eating. I revise my previous stance on Cumberbatches, May said, taking another enormous bite. I love them. Cumberbatches for everyone. Soon they were sprawled through the cave, May resting her head on Gabe's shoulder, Inez and Saya sitting close enough to gently knock their knees together. Amelia and Sebastian were tangled up in a human knot, kissing the greasy spots on each other's faces and laughing. Hiram remembered his own fleeting moment of holding hands with Alex earlier, the flash of feeling that came with it. He knew he had been blushing. He was probably blushing now. He looked over at Alex quickly to see if he noticed, but he was focused on the slightly burnt meat, chewing like it might disappear if he didn't eat it fast enough. Did Hiram want to go over to him and sit down? Yes. But was that a real feeling? Had something changed when he was remade? There were kids who'd woken up different. Nevaeh didn't have cancer, May didn't have allergies. But why would this be different? Unless it wasn't. Unless Hiram had always been like this. What if he hadn't been able to see it before and being remade was like turning a path in the trail, opening up a view of things that had always been right there? After eating his fill, Alex disappeared back into the depths of his hood like normal, and Hiram breathed a sigh of relief. Hiram moved through the smoky cave, still sharp with the scent of char. He stood at the entrance and looked out, thinking of Jingwei and Sparky. Mostly Sparky. What had the caretaker been trying to tell them? A handprint. Like the panels that opened with a handprint, the ones that meant humans only. A worm. That was weird. Hiram couldn't imagine why Sparky would show them a worm. He thought about every species of worm he'd seen or read about in a nature guide, but none of them were special or important. A big open pit. Could that be something they were supposed to avoid? Something dangerous? A picture of Earth. People, Earth again. Talon hopped up and down on Hiram's shoulder. Hiram stayed lost in his thoughts, but less than a minute later, Talon was screeching directly into his ear. Hiram swiveled his neck and asked, "What's wrong?" But Talon just kept screeching a warning. Hiram looked out of the cave. A storm was crackling to life on the horizon. From this many miles away, it looked like a living thing. It had black clouds for a body, and it crawled toward them on bright flashes of lightning. Jingwei was out there, alone. No, that wasn't quite true. She had Sparky. "We have to get Jingwei," Hiram said, turning to the others and gesturing out at the storm. "She's probably made a decent shelter by now," May said, but she sounded less certain of herself than usual. Hiram couldn't imagine leaving Jingwei out there in the storm. He bounced on the balls of his feet. He didn't want to wait here, paralyzed. He couldn't do nothing. Again. He took off into the first patter of rain. "Hiram, wait!" Amelia called after him. But he was already running full tilt, over the slippery rocks at the mouth of the cave, down into the brush. Every fear left over from that day on the mountain came with him. Talon flew overhead, keeping a little of the rain off with his leathery umbrella wings. "Go back, Talon!" Hiram yelled. "Go back to the cave!" All he could think of was Basco. He'd never know what had happened to his dog, and it was all his fault. But Talon stuck with him. The drops were as shiny as metal against the dark sky. Hiram tugged up the zipper of his windbreaker. He told himself not to panic. The run to Jingwei's camp felt longer than it should. But maybe that was just the storm, slowing him down. Or maybe he'd already lost his way, taken a wrong turn. He couldn't get lost again. He had to make it to the camp because Sparky had something important to say. It hadn't tried to hurt him. Was it really just trying to lure him in with promises of a grander purpose, a place in something bigger? Was there something it wanted before it tore him apart? Wind smacked into Hiram. Rain snaked down the back of his neck. The windbreaker couldn't keep him dry. He wiggled his feet in his shoes, savoring the last dry spots on his socks before even those were gone. Hiram remembered this feeling. He should turn around, get to the safety of the cave. The logic that had been turned off when he ran into the storm flooded back now. Hiram was being ridiculous. Jingwei would make it through the night. She was the most resourceful of all of them. But this wasn't just about Jingwei anymore. Hiram skidded, slid. He smacked into the cold, wet ground. His palms were stinging. His wrist hurt from catching his weight. His side ached where he'd fallen, but he didn't think anything was broken. Talon landed next to him, nudging at Hiram with his hard little head. "I'm okay," Hiram said. "I think." He stood up, slowly, feeling out his entire body. Hiram could only imagine how the group would look at him if he came back to camp with broken bones. He was already the odd man out, the one who was too young to really fit. He was the one who didn't even know who he wanted to be with, let alone how to make that a reality. He was the one who wanted to talk to a caretaker when the rest of them just wanted to survive. He got up and ran, limping slightly, breathing hard. Last time he'd been running toward safety. This time he was running away from it. He wasn't making the same mistakes in his life. He was making all new ones. Talon flew behind him, nudging his back with encouragement. He really was as good as a dog. Hiram had gotten at least one thing right. "Cumberbatches for everyone," he said, as he stumbled into Jingwei's camp. She was huddled under her shelter in such close quarters with the caretaker that Hiram's heart skidded frantically. But when Hiram let the initial moment of fear pass, he saw that Sparky was covering her with leaves, trying to keep her dry. They reminded Hiram of him and Basco, or him and Talon. He walked right up to the shelter and Jingwei smiled, her lips pale, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her jumpsuit. She looked freezing, but the roof of her little shelter seemed to be mostly holding. "Out for a stroll in the rain?" she asked. "No," Hiram said. He took a deep breath and moved over to the caretaker. "I came to bring you to shelter, but I need to be sure it's safe. I want to figure out the message." The caretaker stood up taller on its many legs, looking eager. "The handprint means that we're here to do something only humans can do," Hiram said. "Right?" Sparky nodded. It looked for all the world like it was trying to encourage him. "The worm," Hiram said and faltered. "I don't know about the worm." Jingwei grabbed Hiram's hand. "He's flashing just the worm and the pit over and over really fast." "Maybe they go together?" Hiram said. "Worm pit?" said Jingwei. That didn't make any sense. "Wormhole," Hiram whispered. "That's what Arcadia told Holden and Inez. People made wormholes so they could leave Earth while the caretakers fixed it." Sparky leaped. It almost looked like the caretaker was dancing with excitement. And it was like Hiram had rounded another corner in the path, or reached the peak of the mountain because he could see. The view that opened up, the awe of being part of something bigger. Earth. Then people, then Earth again. The humans who made the wormholes left Earth, but it's time for them to come back. We're here to bring them back. Sparky leaped up again, its blue sparks flying faster. It pushed forward until it was right in front of Hiram, nodding and sparking and telling him why they were here, why they'd been remade. The purpose Hiram had been looking for. "That changes everything," Hiram shouted. "Everybody needs to know this." He tried to imagine bringing Sparky back to camp and the mess that would ensue. He touched the spot on his cheek where Inez or Amelia or Gabe had almost speared him earlier. "Maybe if I tell them first." I think you already did," Jingwei said. Hiram turned and saw the group, every last one of them standing at the far edge of the clearing. Despite the rain, they were perfectly still, all of them glued to the scene of Hiram talking to a caretaker. "What are you doing here?" he asked. His voice cracked over the words. "Did you really think we'd let you go out in this alone?" May asked. "You scared the shit out of us, Hiram," Inez added. "What are you doing?" She was giving him a chance to explain himself, to say that Jingwei or Sparky had tricked him, that there was a perfectly logical reason behind him talking to a caretaker. But he didn't want to lie anymore. He knotted his hands together. At first, I just came to help Jingwei. But then I needed to know. May looked at Hiram like he was painfully naive. You shouldn't have come out here alone. I followed my instincts, Hiram said. We all followed our instincts and decided to trust one another. And it's not just because we're humans and they're caretakers. It's not like humans have a great track record of being nice to one another. But we still trust one another. We have to if we don't want to be alone. Saya walked forward as if she were being pulled in by a string that the rest of them couldn't see. What you just figured out? We have to tell the others about this. Wait, what others? Jingwei asked. Hiram watched as people looked at one another meaningfully. There are more of us, he said slowly. We split up before you arrived. They went to find some kind of abandoned city, Saya said, and then added, sanctuary, at the same moment that Inez said, Don't tell her. What happened to we're all supposed to vote? May shouted. Sparky seemed to go into some kind of nervous caretaker mode, its red eye blaring. Hiram saw Jingwei biting her lip, listening. What is it telling you? Not safe, she said. That place, wherever your friends went, it's got some pretty strong warning labels on it. I can't believe I agree with a caretaker, Inez muttered. If they're in danger, Gabe said. We have to go get them, May finished. Nobody's going anywhere tonight, Inez said, taking control again. You would all get pneumonia and die. May gave Inez one of her best glares. I mean, we should vote on it in the morning? All right, let's get back to the cave, Inez said. All of us, Saya said, looking at Jingwei. Hiram could feel the argument coming as Inez's shoulders tightened. That thing's not coming. Sparky can stay outside, Hiram said, at least until Jingwei is dry. Lightning cracked the sky as if on cue, and Hiram jolted. I don't want anyone to get hurt. Same as you, he told Inez. It's way too dangerous to be out in this. Jingwei needs to come back with us. Alex's hand went up before Inez could even call for a vote. The rest of the hands in the group followed. Inez swung around to face Jingwei. If it hurts any of them, if it so much as Cyclops glares at someone the wrong way, he won't, Jingwei said. Hiram waited as the group left the clearing in twos and threes, talking about their friends in Sanctuary, talking about Sparky's purpose. Jingwei and Sparky left last, and Jingwei gave Hiram a grateful nod. Alex hung back, not talking, just waiting. His hands were shoved deep in his hoodie pockets, probably still warm and dry. Hiram found himself hoping that Alex would grab his hand and press their fingers together again. If Alex asked him what the weird look on his face meant, he wouldn't be able to lie. Hiram really was a terrible liar. But Alex just started walking next to him, quiet and easy, despite the storm lashing the woods around them. They let the rest of the group walk far ahead, and it didn't feel like they were putting on a show for anyone or keeping a secret. They just walked together, close enough that Hiram's shoulder brushed Alex's a few times. If you go rushing out to rescue someone again, I'll come with you, Alex said. If you want. Even though the rain was as cold as ever and Hiram's socks were officially wet, he felt warm. I'd like that. They filed back toward the cave. The rush of the rain turned into a soft pattering, and the harsh tilt of the world, the one Hiram had felt every day since they were remade, finally settled. In the morning, the storm would leave everything washed bright and clean. Hiram was going to make it home. This has been Remade. Season 2, Episode 5, Man's Best Friend. Written by Amy Rose Capetta. Narrated by Greg Tremblay. Audio produced by Amanda Rose Smith. Musical theme by Amanda Rose Smith. Copyright 2017 Cereal Box Publishing. Production copyright 2017 Cereal Box Publishing.